Hey everybody, John Miller again. So here's part two, and part two has to do with the original 13 colonies, how they were settled, and just some basic characteristics of what they were like, who went there, how they got started. In part one, if you missed it, that deals with the first two questions I pose at the beginning of that episode, and it mainly has to do with how the English colonized Ireland and how they applied those lessons that they learned there to North America. And then the second question and the second part of that episode has to do with the way that Native Americans dealt with the English and the various crises that Native Americans faced in North America in the late 15, early 1600s. Okay? Enjoy part two. All right, on to something a little less depressing, and that is the settling of the 13 colonies. And I'm going to talk about each one of these briefly. I will get into a little more specifics in later episodes and talk about big events and things that shaped the 13 colonies in general, but I just want to run through each of them one at a time and give you a sense of what they were like, at least in the 1600s, although in the case of some of them, Georgia, for instance, wasn't established until 1733, so there's not really much for me to say about what Georgia was like in the 1600s. But I came up with what I think is a pretty fun little gimmick, and that is based upon what I know of the colonial history of these colonies, and based upon what we kind of now think of, for those of us who know something about them as states, I came up with a colonial slogan or motto. Each state, of course, in the United States, has a state motto. You can look it up. And I thought it would be fun to come up with a colonial motto. These are not PG rated in some cases, so just be aware of that if you happen to be in a car listening with kids or something. This is not a very PG podcast, though, so I would imagine a lot of you out there are using the proper judgment when listening to it, but there's a warning just in case. So, first of all, I'm going to start with, of course, Virginia, the first colony. And what I'm going to do is read through some of the stuff that I have here that I think is noteworthy for each of these colonies, and at the end, I'm going to introduce the motto or slogan for each of them. As I discussed in the previous episode, Jamestown was the first successful, and by that I mean the first colony established that actually persisted, that lasted, that did not fade away into oblivion or have everybody die or anything. And that becomes, for a time, the capital of Virginia as a colony. And not surprisingly, Virginia becomes really big and powerful and has a lot of influence up through the first few decades of American independence because of how long it's been around. And it still has a pretty good amount of influence. Obviously, it's one of the states that the District of Columbia is adjacent to. And so it has a lot of influence in that way, and it's been around for a long time and so forth. But it carries a lot of influence in the colonial days and in the first 50-ish years of the United States as an independent country. So the House of Burgesses, which is a legislature, effectively, convened for the first time in 1619. So that's the very first legislature that ever met in U.S. history, met in 1619 in colonial Virginia. Only freemen could vote, and the governor of Virginia had a powerful veto. As I think I mentioned in the previous episode, and as I will mention again, there's a kind of a fraught relationship between the governor of Virginia and the legislature in many instances. And sometimes the governor, and this is true of all the colonies, well, it's true of most of the colonies at one time or another, that the whoever is governor has kind of divided loyalties between the people in the colony and the British government. But they wanted to make the governor pretty powerful, and he was. There was something called the headright system, which was begun in 1617, and that encouraged indentured servants to come over. And I want to briefly define what an indentured servant is. The simplest way to explain it is it's essentially temporary slavery. And nearly 2/3 of the English who came to British North America in the 1600s were indentured servants. The way it would typically work is English people who did not have the means to come to North America because it was expensive to pay for the voyage over would agree to labor for a period of usually 5 to 7 years for a benefactor, a landowner in British North America, who would pay for their voyage over, and then they would do labor for that person for 5 to 7 years, at which point they would be let go and they would be free to sort of do what they wanted. Indentured servants were supposed to receive freedom dues that early on included land, but they became more and more meager over time in general. That's a generalization. It's not absolutely true across the board. Indentured servants also often did not survive their indenture. Sounds fantastic, right? Hey, would you like to come over and be a temporary slave for a few years and maybe you'll make it and maybe you won't? Literally like 50% of indentured servants didn't survive. And their treatment in a lot of cases was comparably harsh to that of chattel slaves. I don't want to say that it was the same, but from what I've read, they could be beaten, they could be starved, they could be punished in a variety of ways where they didn't really have much say. And there were instances in which indentured servants tried to run off before their indenture was over, in much the same way that chattel slaves, African slaves, would run away because their slavery was permanent. It was rough. It was really rough. And yet, a lot of people signed up for it. Tells you something about how bad things must have been in Europe, right? In England in particular. Tobacco was very well established by the time that indentured servitude becomes a big thing, by the time the headright system is a thing in 1617. That was understood to be the way that Virginians would make a living, is growing and harvesting tobacco. And the thing about tobacco that's important to know is that it's a land-hungry crop, meaning it depletes the soil of its nutrients very quickly. And most colonists came to be landowners. So there's a lot of demand for land on which to grow tobacco, and that land does not remain productive for very long. Colonists, therefore, were often looking for more and more land to grow more and more tobacco. And in addition to that, would often have livestock, whether it's goats or cattle or pigs or sheep or whatever, that would wander around and eat the greenery. And the reason I'm mentioning both of these things is that they had a common effect, which is to swallow up a lot of Native American land, whether that meant land that was being destroyed by animals grazing, and that could be farmland that Native Americans were using to grow crops, or it could be hunting areas that Native Americans needed in order to hunt the animals that they survived on. That's a way in which European settlement and expansion had harmful effects on Native Americans. And then there's also just the acquisition of more land as old tobacco lands became unproductive and new lands were sought, and as more and more people came over and wanted to be tobacco farmers, or as more and more people came out of their indenture and wanted their own land to be tobacco farmers. So all of this means that there's more and more encroachment on Native American land, and it just makes the already existing tensions with Native Americans, which got going pretty much from the jump. I mean, by 1609, 1610, there's violence between Native Americans and settlers of Jamestown for these same reasons. Although, in addition to the things I'd mentioned, the starving time is going on in Jamestown, and Native Americans are having their crops just straight up stolen, their food straight up stolen by Jamestown colonists who are trying to survive. In 1622, March of 1622, there was an attack by Powhatan's successor, and I looked this up. I found a couple different versions of it. I'm going to try both. It's difficult. It's Ope Changano. That's one pronunciation. I've also heard Ope Kangano. And I think that's where the emphasis goes, and I think I'm saying that right based on what I've heard. However, I'm going to post the spelling in the YouTube video. You'll see what I mean. This is not an easy one. Anyway, in March 1622, the Powhatan's successor to power, Ope Changano, or Ope Kangano, attacked the Jamestown settlement. 330 people were killed, so it wasn't nothing. It's a significant attack. And that leads to a decade of brutal retaliation by the colonists. So up until like 1632, there's fighting. And the colonists, because of this attack, and this is a pattern that gets established, unfortunately, for Native Americans, because of this attack by the Powhatan Native Confederacy, they feel justified in doing kind of whatever they want to Native Americans. And yeah, the attack is bad. It kills a lot of people. And maybe you could make the argument that the Powhatans might have pursued some form of diplomacy. However, they had reason to be pissed off. So I'm not really sure who's right and who's wrong here. But it ends up being really bad for both sides, and it establishes this pattern of just really ugly hostility between the two sides that means a lot of dead people, just almost endless fighting that doesn't really go away. Once this series of attacks happens, that provides an excuse for the government in Britain, well, in England, there's not really a Britain yet, that provides an excuse for the government in England to revoke the charter held by the Virginia Company for the colony of Jamestown and make Jamestown/Virginia a royal colony at this point, which means that the government in England is now more or less directly in charge. James I formally kind of takes control by 1624. The attacks by the Powhatans and other natives, again, they allowed the English to say these are savages, and they shouldn't be treated with the dignity that civilized people deserve. There's a peace treaty, finally, in 1646. It rejected any hope of assimilating Native Americans, and that became the dominant pattern in English colonies, is that the English were a lot more separate from the Native Americans than, say, the French or the Spanish. And it is one of the things that leads to greater and greater hostility. The natives still did trade with the English, and there were English merchants and companies that made products specifically for the Native American market. So it wasn't as though there was no interaction at all, or that it was all violent and fighting and terrible. But it was the case that there wasn't any commingling, really, as had been the case with the Spanish and the French. In 1619, the first African slaves are brought to Jamestown and purchased to work in the rapidly evolving tobacco industry. And this signals a change. Now, it is not a huge impact immediately. It does not change the basic dynamic of what is going on in Virginia. Mostly, it's that the mortality rates in Virginia, as I discussed in the previous episode, 25% of the people who settled in Jamestown made it through the first 15 or so years that the colony existed. And if you're a big landowner, you're not going to want to invest a bunch of money in an African slave, or many of them, if you think they are likely to die very soon. It's much safer from an economic point of view to get yourself some indentured servants. And if they die, it's no great loss for you economically. All of that sounds very callous, I know, but this is me just kind of trying to imagine how they would have thought about it. And that's important to do with any kind of historical thinking. You don't want to moralize too much. I mean, obviously, slavery itself, thinking of the deaths of workers as economic costs and nothing more, that is morally repugnant to us from our modern perspective. I find it morally repugnant. But I think it's important to try to look at it the way that they did and imagine why things unfolded as they did. So, though the first African slaves arrive in 1619, African slaves don't have a really dramatic effect on any of the colonies until really the 1700s. And it's not until then that the mortality rates get a little more under control. As mortality rates decline, as more and more people are living longer, it becomes more justifiable from an economic point of view to have investment in African slaves. All of this meant that big landholders became the dominant power brokers and the dominant holders of economic influence in Virginia. There's a few families, and a lot of them are intermarried, that are essentially recreating the old aristocratic class system that existed in England in Virginia. So Virginia, from the start and really throughout the colonial period and even into the post-revolutionary period, has this reputation as an aristocratic stronghold full of wealthy landholders that dominate everything. Thus, Virginia's motto: Virginia, we're better than you, and we know it. Yeah, if you're a fan of early 2000s comedy, I hope you appreciate that reference as much as I do. But it just seemed really appropriate to me. I'm going to do these kind of chronologically, but also sort of by section. So the next colony I'm going to deal with is Maryland. Now, Maryland is not next chronologically. That's actually Plymouth. But Maryland is settled fairly shortly after Virginia is. And of course, it is right next to Virginia. So let's talk about Maryland. Maryland was founded as a proprietary colony by Cecil Calvert, a.k.a. Lord Baltimore. So now you know where that comes from if you didn't already. He was the son of a former Secretary of State to King Charles I, and it was founded, Maryland was, in 1632. It was envisioned as a giant feudal domain. These folks really just can't seem to quit feudalism, can they? This is the 1600s, at a time when feudalism has really kind of been dying a slow death for a long time. Totally dead in a lot of places, but yeah, they just can't seem to give it up. So it was envisioned as a giant feudal domain, and it was going to be laid out in manors by Baltimore to his relatives and friends who would pay him quit rents. And quit rents, just to quickly define that as a term, it's essentially just a form of rent that would be paid to the highest vassal or landholder. And it could be money, it could be crops, it could be whatever. Also, Cecil Calvert saw Maryland as a potential haven for Catholics. He himself was a Catholic, and this is in the 1630s. This is at a time when Catholics are very much the minority in England. The Protestant Reformation has taken hold, the Church of England has become dominant, and Catholics are kind of persona non grata at this point. Despite the majority of people who went to Maryland actually being Protestant, Calvert and other Catholics like him from his family thought that this could be a place where Catholics might be safe in the New World. There is something that is passed in Maryland known as the Act of Toleration in 1649, and it protected all Christians and at the same time, sentence those denying Christ's divinity to death. So, kind of progressive for its time, although you certainly wouldn't want to be a Jew, let's say, in Maryland, even after this act went into place, or Hindu, or Buddhist or something, God forbid. Its influence is big because of the new ground that it covered. But it didn't last too long. It was rescinded in 1652, just 3 years later, because there was a Protestant takeover. Again, they are the majority, Protestants are. This is the beginning of a pattern of toleration being instituted and then rescinded and then instituted and then rescinded, because different groups of people are holding power until the United States becomes an independent country. It became, like Virginia, and not surprisingly, a tobacco plantation, because it had the same climate and soil, and it's right next door. Ultimately, it was dependent on, by the mid 1600s, indentured labor and later enslaved Africans, as was the case in Virginia. So it's essentially like Virginia, except there's a lot of fighting about Catholicism. So Maryland's slogan, Catholics are people too. All right, the Carolinas, which full disclosure, I have a lot of family ties to North Carolina. That is where my dad's entire side of the family is from. It's Appalachia. I am descended from straight up hillbillies in western North Carolina. Originally, it was the Carolina colony, one thing. I should backtrack a bit and say that the chaos of the English Civil War, which went on from 1642 to 1651, and the authoritarian protectorate of Oliver Cromwell, also known as the English Commonwealth, which was in place from 1653 to 1659, all of that seriously interrupted immigration from England to North America. So from 1642 to about 1660, there's not very many people coming over to North America from England. Carolina was actually formally created in 1670 through land grants to 8 nobles who, surprise, surprise, were favorites of King Charles II. He is the son of the guy who was executed by beheading after the English Civil War was over. The founders of Carolina aspired to be providers of English foodstuffs to the English West Indies, which were big sugar producers, and those are the big money makers. And what the English government and the colonizers of places like Jamaica, what they want is as much sugar produced as humanly possible, because it's tremendously valuable. And so they don't want to use up that land growing food if they don't have to. And what these founders of Carolina thought is that they would grow the food that would supply big plantations in places like Jamaica, so that they didn't have to use up that valuable sugar-producing land on anything other than sugar. They also wanted to produce non-English products like wine, silk, and olive oil to import to the Atlantic world. By the early 1700s, South Carolina, or what would be South Carolina, had committed to rice cultivation and had imported a lot of African slaves. This is despite the fact that the 8 founders of Carolina actually really didn't want to incorporate slavery into the colony. Of course, it wasn't too long after the colony was founded that one of the big exports of Carolina became Native American slaves, mostly to New England and the West Indies. North Carolina was broken off from South Carolina and kind of Virginia by migrants out of Virginia in about 1653 is when those migrants started to leave. They considered themselves kind of an officially different entity when South Carolina had its charter approved in 1663. North Carolina is decidedly different from what would be South Carolina. South Carolina ended up being dominated by wealthy landholders. In this case, it was wealthy landholders who grew rice and not tobacco, but wealthy landholders nonetheless. And North Carolina, on the other hand, was made up of small farmers who didn't like aristocratic Virginia, also trappers and traders, and in some cases, escaped indentured servants, and also religious dissenters. So, South Carolina's state motto, even sweatier Virginia. If you've been to South Carolina, I think you know what I'm talking about. And North Carolina's motto being that it is made up of largely people who wanted to escape the aristocrats in Virginia, and to some extent the aristocrats in South Carolina, is fuck them rich people. I'm picturing the Jordan meme. And as you will see, that is an ethos that really persists throughout North Carolina's history. Finally, in the Southern Colonies, there's Georgia. And I alluded to this earlier. Georgia is by far the latest of the colonies established. It was founded in 1733, and that is 52 years after Pennsylvania, which is the second to last colony founded by chronology. Georgia was initially intended as a buffer between Spanish Florida on the one hand and French Louisiana on the other hand, and South Carolina. Georgia also was founded as kind of a penal colony, but also kind of a respite, a refuge for mostly debtors by a guy named James Oglethorpe, who had really pretty noble intentions for what Georgia was going to be. He wanted to bring people to Georgia as an alternative to having them rot away in debtor's prison. And he also wanted to push against having slavery in Georgia the way that the original founders of the Carolina colony wanted to push against having slavery in South Carolina. However, he, like the founders of the South Carolina colony, failed. And slavery became a big, important part of Georgia in much the same way it did in South Carolina for much the same reason. Georgia became a rice plantation colony in addition to being a buffer and a haven for debtors. It did promote religious tolerance in much the same way as North Carolina and kind of Maryland, for all Christians except for Catholics, which, again, by the standard of the day was pretty progressive. Obviously now we would see that as pretty absurd. So Georgia's motto is the human shield colony. Makes sense, right? Massachusetts, another heavyweight, if you will, in the colonial scheme. It, that is to say Massachusetts, is founded initially in the early 1600s, 1620 to be precise, is when Plymouth is founded as a colony. And Plymouth is the first of two separate colonies, actually, that will ultimately be Massachusetts. There's Plymouth, and then there's the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they will ultimately be merged to make Massachusetts. But that does not happen until the late 1600s. So for a few decades, you've got Plymouth on the one hand and Massachusetts Bay on the other. It was established, as we discussed in the previous episode, and as I think many Americans know, by the Pilgrims. And the Pilgrims were what we call separatist Puritans. Okay, they were Puritans, which meant that they were Protestants who thought that the Church of England was far too close in its structure and in its observances and in its behaviors. Mostly what they objected to was episcopacy, okay? The existence of bishops, really, of a church hierarchy. That was what they objected to more than anything. And episcopacy, it's why the Church of England in America is now called the Episcopalian Church. That's where that comes from. But they, the Pilgrims, and Puritans in general, did not like that because they thought that no human being should have a higher rank or a closer relationship to God. That was an affront in their mind to the good old days of Christianity not long after Jesus had lived. So they wanted everybody to be nice and equal. They didn't want a hierarchy. And the Pilgrims, the separatist Puritans, were the most hardcore about their disagreements with the Church of England, and they wanted to bail. And they did, in really before 1620. Initially, they went to Holland, the Netherlands, and then from there, they went to the New World in 1620. The Puritan exodus increases in the 1620s and 30s as Charles I demonstrates a lot of hostility toward Puritans specifically, but even kind of from the Puritan and from a lot of Anglicans' point of view, a regression, if you will, toward Catholicism. They thought he was Charles I was creeping the Church of England back toward Catholicism, and that really made a lot of Puritans uncomfortable, so they started to bail. In 1629, Charles dismisses Parliament and begins persecution of Puritans under the Archbishop William Laud, the Archbishop of the Church of England. During this Great Migration, as it is referred to, of the 1630s, when all these Puritans took off, tens of thousands left England and Scotland for Ireland, continental Europe, and the West Indies and New England. So it wasn't just Puritans leaving and going to Plymouth or the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were heading to anywhere that wasn't England or Scotland, because those places were under the most direct control of England. Scotland was independent and fought fiercely for its independence, but it still is right next door to England's on the same island. And that made a lot of Scottish Puritans uncomfortable enough that they were like, we're getting out of here too. Puritans were generally Calvinists, although they had some diverse views. I think it's an oversimplification to say that they were just Calvinists. They were united by their rejection of Anglican similarities to Catholic clerical structure and by certain religious doctrines. Puritan, as I mentioned in the previous episode, was kind of meant derisively. It was not a compliment. It was a way of castigating people because Puritans were not just perceived as different or obnoxious or whatever. They were perceived as questioners of authority and troublemakers. The advantage of the Church of England to the monarchy and to other wealthy, powerful people in England was that it took all of the religious authority that had been the province of the Catholic Church, not to mention all of the property and all of the money that would have gone to the Catholic Church, and kept it in-house for the monarchs, for the landed class. So to be a Puritan was to be kind of a thorn in the side of not just the Church of England or the Catholic Church, but also for the monarchy and for, to some degree, the aristocracy. You seemed like somebody, in their eyes, in the eyes of these people in authority, who didn't want to accept their authority. And there's some truth to that. So the Puritans, were really picked on and persecuted as troublemakers in the eyes of people in positions of power and wealth and authority. The Puritans founded Massachusetts Bay Colony also after Plymouth, and these are people that are a little more conciliatory toward the Church of England. They are not quite as hostile to the Church of England and what it was as the separatist Puritans, the Pilgrims who founded Plymouth Colony. Massachusetts Bay was founded in 1629 by the Massachusetts Bay Company. In the last episode, I had mentioned that originally the Pilgrims had made their deal with the Virginia Company, and they were going to head to Virginia, but they missed. Just a little. They ended up settling initially as squatters in what is now Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and from there created a legal authority for their land ownership with the English government. In the case of Massachusetts Bay, they founded it with their own joint stock company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, and the funders were merchants who wanted trade with Native Americans and were Puritans themselves and wanted to see their religious ideals advanced. John Winthrop is kind of seen as the leading figure in the early days of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and envisions it as, and this is language that has been used repeatedly ever since John Winthrop said it way back in the first half of the 17th century, he envisioned Massachusetts Bay as a city on a hill. You heard, I mean, the first figure who said that a lot that comes to my mind is Ronald Reagan, who liked to talk about what Reagan called American exceptionalism, this idea that America is this shining beacon of how to be to the rest of humanity. And that's certainly the way that John Winthrop thought about the Massachusetts Bay Colony and what he saw in his head, what he wanted it to be. Winthrop hoped, as did other Puritans, that Massachusetts Bay would allow for the flourishing of Puritanism and that it would eventually make its way back to Europe and become much more common as a religious practice in England and in continental Europe. None of these guys are real short on ego. Let's say that. They have pretty grandiose visions for themselves and their societies. Generally, New England settled as towns and villages as opposed to what you saw in like Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas and Georgia, which tended to be settled in large swaths of land, of farmland, of agricultural land. That's what drove the economy in those colonies in the South. New England didn't really have the right climate conditions or soil conditions for those things to happen. On top of that, you had communities of people who went to these New England colonies like Massachusetts Bay rather than individuals who went as indentured servants and were trying to just better their own situation. Indentured servants were usually single men, and they were trying to just make their situation better. And then sometimes you had people who were not the firstborn sons of an aristocratic family who went to, say, Virginia or South Carolina because they weren't going to inherit the land and titles that their older brothers or brother was going to. And they saw going to the New World as a better option for them since they weren't going to inherit the land and title that the eldest brother, eldest son would. That's not what's going on in New England. You get these communities of people that are sticking together, that are helping each other out, and that have this kind of utopian vision of society. Not only that, the climate and the soil are just not good for growing cash crops on a large scale. The soil is rocky and not as rich in nutrients, and the weather is just not suitable for growing stuff like tobacco or rice, certainly. All of these differences meant that colonies like Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth took on a very different character. Given that they're Puritans, it is kind of a who can out-severe each other in terms of their adherence to religious dogma, okay? It's not... I've read accounts of scholars who talk about Puritans, oh, they really weren't that severe, and oh, they liked to have sex because they had a lot of kids and stuff like that. That didn't mean they were a barrel of laughs. And it certainly didn't mean that they were not in the habit of judging the bejesus out of each other and disagreeing with each other on these little, I think, fairly frivolous interpretations of the Bible and of religious doctrine, all that sort of thing. So I think the appropriate colonial motto for Massachusetts is the absolutely no fun zone. I mean, you could, I guess, sort of apply that to a few other of the Puritan colonies, but I think Massachusetts in particular, it seems fitting. New Hampshire. New Hampshire, also founded by Puritans, as is Connecticut. And I'm going to kind of do them together a little here because they are not as prominent and as affecting to the rest of the colonies as Massachusetts ultimately would be. So in 1622, Sir Ferdinand Gorges and his council for New England granted a colonial charter to these fishermen from Newfoundland. I'd mentioned in the previous episode that Newfoundland was really important to the French. Also to the English, there were these really rich fisheries that became big suppliers of food to North and Western Europe. This group of fishermen decided, we're going to head west and south a little bit and establish our own colony on the mainland. Nominally, New Hampshire was a part of Massachusetts in the 1630s and 40s, although, loosely, and a lot of this stuff is really loose in these early decades of the New England colonies. Some merchants who wanted more emphasis on commerce and less on religion, they migrated to Portsmouth. In the 1640s and 1650s, New Hampshire was officially granted a royal charter by Charles II in 1679. So that's quite a bit after the 1620s charters that were granted to Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, respectively. Connecticut was originally founded as the separate Connecticut and New Haven colonies in 1636 and 1638. So that is similar to Massachusetts in the sense that what we now think of as Connecticut, what is Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, and would be the colony of Connecticut, was founded not as one colony on its own, but as two. Another kind of important factor in Connecticut is that the fundamental orders were put into place there in 1639, and that is the first written constitution to establish a new government in what will be the United States. So it's a pretty big deal. And I know I mentioned the Mayflower Compact in the previous episode as the basis for a constitution, but it isn't actually a constitution. So the fundamental orders, it is for real constitution and thus pretty significant. You did not have to be a church member, like in Massachusetts, to vote. New Haven founders wanted an even closer relationship between church and state than that of Massachusetts. So in that case, they're even more religious. Connecticut did finally receive a royal charter in 1662, legitimizing its government under the fundamental orders in England. New Haven begrudgingly merged with Connecticut in 1664 as an alternative to merging with the Anglicans, those people, in New York. So you put the Puritans in a position of, look, either you're going to merge with the Anglican Dutch, ew, right, in New York, or you're going to merge with these other Puritans that maybe you're not crazy about, and they went with the latter. So for their colonial mottos, New Hampshire, as the commerce-focused Puritans, I thought the appropriate motto was Puritan Ballers. Yeah. And then Connecticut, they're the shotgun marriage colony. Because New Haven begrudgingly agreed to merge with Connecticut, and as a result, you've got Connecticut as one colony. So that is a government-enforced shotgun marriage, in my view. Rhode Island reminds me a lot of North Carolina. And I think you'll see why in a moment. Rhode Island is to New England what North Carolina is to the Southern Colonies. Rhode Island was established by Roger Williams and his followers in 1636. Roger Williams was a clergyman and a religious dissenter. He had what were, to the Puritan authorities in Massachusetts Bay, some pretty outlandish, crazy ideas. Williams' outlandish, crazy ideas, according to the Puritan authorities, were that there should be a total separation of church and state. He also wanted a total separation from the Church of England and soul liberty, as he put it, which is the idea that individuals would be allowed to follow their consciences freely and not be tied to whatever religious authority might order them to do. And when you think about it, and I've always thought this, it's kind of weird how, and okay, weird is kind, it's hypocritical. It's very hypocritical to me that the Puritans leave England to try to practice their own religion their own way, so they'll be left alone and nobody's going to persecute them and they're going to be free to do what they want, and leave the terrible, awful authorities of the Church of England and the king behind. And then they get to New England and they just get all up in everybody's goddamn business about how they're going to practice, and they just can't wait to tell people what to do. And the nanosecond that somebody really disagrees with them, it's get your ass out the door. So it's one of those groups that, again, the more I read about the Puritans, I find myself being less and less sympathetic to their cause. I mean, you don't want to generalize too much, but come on. Williams is advocating for liberty of conscience. He wants separation of church and state. He rejected the notion of a group of elect people. And this was a pretty common belief amongst a lot of Puritans, that most people were not legitimately saved, and that most people were not going to find their way to the kingdom of heaven. Ultimately, that most Christians, even who profess to be Christian, were not real believers. And there was only this small group of what were called the elect, who were actually committed to salvation and to belief in Jesus, and who were going to be saved and make their way to heaven. And you didn't have any way of knowing whether or not you were going to be a part of the elect. This is one of the core elements or tenets of Calvinism. John Calvin talked about it a lot. This idea that there's predestination, that God knows even before you're born whether or not you're going to be one of the elect and make it to heaven, and that most people wouldn't. There's some dispute about exactly what he meant, but that's certainly how a lot of these Puritan leaders interpreted it and what they saw and what they wanted. So they did not want to surround themselves with impure people. That's one of the reasons they took off from England, is that they thought they were sharing pews in the Church of England with people who really weren't serious, who weren't the really religious ones. So you see what I mean by this being kind of a, hey, I'm more religious than you, and it being kind of a pissing contest about who's more religious. Roger Williams said that the elect is a fallacy, and that faith and belief needed to be voluntary. And he, Williams, decried persecution of any religious doctrine. So he was like, look, everybody should be allowed to believe what they want to believe. I mean, that's soul liberty. In Rhode Island, the colony had no established church. There was no state church, which was very common in all of these New England colonies, but also really common throughout the colonies. Most colonies before the Revolution had an established church. Okay? They had an official church. In Virginia, it was the Church of England, by way of example. In New England, in Massachusetts Bay, there's the Reformed Church. If you were not a member of the church, you couldn't vote, you couldn't hold political office, and you certainly couldn't be any kind of a civic leader if you were not an official member of the church. So Williams wanted to get away from all that, and he thought that there should be no established state church, there should be the separation, and in addition to there being soul liberty and liberty of conscience and more of a separation from the Church of England, which you would understand if he wants no established state religion. Rhode Island was also a lot more democratic than a lot of these other colonies. And by more democratic, I mean that more people had more of a say in how the government operated. This notion of greater or lesser democracy is something that I'm going to talk about fairly frequently throughout these episodes. And generally, what I mean now and what I will mean a lot of the time in the future when I mention it is this idea of how much of a voice do people get, average people get, in their governments, whether it's municipal or county or state or in the entire country. And that is what I mean by more or less democratic. If more people have the right to vote, more people have the right to hold public office, and they exercise it on more frequent occasions, that's more democracy. If fewer people have the right to vote, and fewer people participate in the political process, and fewer people have the ability to hold office or influence civic events, that's less democracy. Okay? So there really are just degrees of how much democracy that exists. And in Rhode Island, it was more democratic. Assembly was elected twice a year. The governor was elected annually, so once a year. And they had frequent town meetings where they would vote on things and decide things. Religious dissenters from all over New England eventually flocked to Rhode Island. Rhode Island got its colonial charter in 1663, right around the same time as South Carolina, and a little bit after a lot of these other Puritan colonies. This is just after Charles II has been restored to the throne. It's during the Stuart Restoration, and things are to some degree normalizing. So, Rhode Island, what is its motto? It's one of my favorites. Because it is such a haven for dissenters, and because they are so allergic to any kind of authority, Rhode Island's motto, fuck me, fuck you! That's Rhode Island, because they want to do what they want to do. Okay, so we've covered the Southern Colonies. We've covered the New England colonies. And now we're going to cover the last group, the Mid-Atlantic colonies. And I've grouped the four that I'm going to discuss together, New York and Delaware as one group, and then Pennsylvania and New Jersey as another group. And they have some common threads, which is part of the reason that I'm doing it. Let me go ahead and get this rolling. New York was established originally, I mentioned this in the previous episode, as New Netherland. I'm saying it as New Netherland because that's how it was spelled. It was Dutch. You could just call it New Netherland. It was initially established in the early 1600s. By 1614, you had traders from the Netherlands operating a regular trade out of Fort Orange, which would ultimately become Albany, what is currently the state capital and has been for a long time. And the Dutch traders, were backed by the Dutch East India Company initially. Then New Amsterdam, what would become New York City, was founded on Manhattan Island not long after Albany was established as a trading hub between the Dutch and Native Americans, and it was populated and settled more by the Dutch over the ensuing decades. The English seized New Netherland during the Anglo-Dutch Wars. There were 3 of them from 1664 to 1674. I mentioned this again in the previous episode. New Netherland was seized at the beginning bloodlessly as part of what I referred to again in the last episode as Restoration imperialism. The idea that the English, during the Stuart Restoration, when Charles II was being put back on the throne after years of no king and a combination of Oliver Cromwell in Parliament running the show in England, the English, when Charles II was restored, decided that they wanted to try to supplant the Netherlands, the Dutch, in as many parts of world commerce as they could. And this was a piece of that. Charles II granted the colony, New Netherland, to his brother James, Duke of York, to run as he saw fit. Thus, as you're probably realizing, why it's New York. New York became a much bigger point of emphasis in commerce and politics as the English used it for trade and as a launching point for attacks against the French, who were established in Canada at this point, to the north, almost due north, but a little, I guess, northwest in Quebec, up the St. Lawrence River. The population grew pretty precipitously from 9,000 to 20,000 from 1664 to 1685. So the population grew a lot from 9,000 in 1664 to 20,000 by 1685. Delaware, on the other hand, was established by the Swedes, the Swedish, at Fort Christina, which is now Wilmington, the biggest city there, in 1638. So a little bit after the Dutch had established themselves in New York, and around about the same time as various groups of Puritans were establishing places like New Hampshire and Connecticut. Eventually, Delaware was captured by the Dutch in 1655. The Swedes couldn't hold it, so they didn't last as North American colonizers for very long, and it was incorporated into New Netherland. Okay, so it was a part of New York for a time. It was taken from the Dutch along with New York in 1664 by the English. So when the English took New York from the Dutch, they also took Delaware. Delaware was considered a part of the Pennsylvania land grant to William Penn in 1682, and it was governed as a part of that colony until 1701. So it has been both Delaware, a part of New York, and a part of Pennsylvania at various times. Delaware's economic similarities to the Chesapeake colonies, and I mean Maryland and Virginia, and therefore its embrace of slavery meant that it clashed with the Quakers who administered Pennsylvania, because the Quakers who established Pennsylvania and were ultimately in charge of it did not like slavery at all. They were very anti-slavery. They're some of the biggest anti-slavery activists early in American history, and they wanted to kind of disassociate themselves from Delaware after it had embraced a tobacco plantation kind of economy and started to use African slaves. Ultimately, Delaware was granted a separate legislature and a royal charter in 1701. Given all of that, I'd say that the colonial slogan for New York, as it is pretty aristocratic, especially upstate, and a big hub of trade and population, New York's colonial slogan is Virginia, but with wooden shoes and windmills, due to its Dutch history. And Delaware is one of my favorites. Delaware, I refer to as New York's vestigial tail, because it was a part of New York and then ultimately a part of Pennsylvania, and then finally its own thing. And let's face it, to this day, apart from being the head of a lot of credit card companies and the home of Joe Biden, Delaware doesn't have a huge claim to fame. I cannot help, I will never, as a child of the 90s, forget Wayne's World making fun of Delaware. Hi, I'm in Delaware. Check it out if you haven't seen it. Last one. Well, last two, I should say. There's two more of these. The last two are Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And these are both definitely mid-Atlantic colonies. And what they share, apart from being right next to each other, is that they are established more or less both by Quakers. Pennsylvania and the West Jersey colonies, because originally New Jersey, what is now New Jersey, was separated into West Jersey and East Jersey. They were founded on behalf of the Society of Friends, which is the kind of formal name for the Quakers. William Penn and his family were owed a huge debt by the English monarchy in the late 1600s. So he, William Penn, persuaded Charles II, who was king at the time, to grant him Pennsylvania as a form of payment. And that was totally groovy with Charles II, not only because it paid off the debt that his family and the monarchy owed to Penn's family, but it enabled him, Charles II, to get rid of these crazy Quakers. And why were the Quakers so crazy? Well, they had these outlandish ideas that classes were bad and that people should just be treated like people and there should be no legal privileges for some groups over others. That, combined with the fact that the Quakers, rejected the Church of England and all kinds of other authority. The Puritans looked like troublemakers. The Quakers looked like what would have been the 18th century, 17th century equivalent of anarchists from the monarchist's point of view. Charles II gave Pennsylvania to William Penn as a form of payment for their debts and as an opportunity to get rid of the crazy Quakers. Okay? Penn had already helped, before he got the land grant, a group of Quakers from England purchase West Jersey, which, as I already mentioned, was half of New Jersey, from a guy named Lord John Berkeley, who'd gotten title to the land from the Duke of York. So this guy Berkeley, he got the land from Charles II's brother, and William Penn effectively helped these colonists, these Quakers, purchased the land from Berkeley that became West Jersey. East Jersey became a haven for Presbyterians from either Scotland or England. So people that were looking to escape the persecution or marginalization they felt back in England, they established East Jersey. William Penn was the main author of the West Jersey Concessions of 1677, which was the form of government that would administer West Jersey and ultimately East Jersey together. West Jersey Concessions created an elected assembly with broad suffrage, which is the right to vote, and significant religious liberty, because the Quakers were like hippie anarchists of that period, as I've already mentioned. So it was pretty liberal in a lot of ways, especially by the standards of the time. Penn hoped that West Jersey would become a society of small farmers rather than a carbon copy or facsimile of aristocratic Virginia or South Carolina. He kind of had in mind the same thing that James Oglethorpe did, although Penn, was even more religiously tolerant and wanted to see an even more egalitarian society. Pennsylvania was crafted in the same mold as a proprietary colony of Penn's that would be structured and governed based on Quaker principles. So that is to say that it would be a proprietary colony like Maryland, but it wouldn't have a specific agenda the way that Calvert had for Maryland of, Catholic exceptionalism or at least Catholic toleration. This would be, in Penn's view, this kind of utopia he was going to create that was a lot more tolerant of everybody. Pennsylvania was hands down the most gracious to Native Americans, one of the most religiously tolerant, and one of the most democratic of the 13 colonies, while maintaining strict moral codes, because the Quakers, while tolerant, also were very religious. They wanted to make sure that everybody behaved up to a certain standard. So they forbade swearing, drunkenness, adultery, of course, and blood sports like cockfighting, and I think boxing. Pennsylvania was really meant to be kind of a Quaker haven and was a lot kinder, at least for the time that William Penn was alive, to Native Americans than any other colony. It's kind of funny because when I think of Pennsylvania, like a lot of Americans, the first thing I actually think of is Pittsburgh, because my sister lives there and has a family there, and it's awesome, by the way. Like, I've visited Pittsburgh a bunch, and I'm going there tomorrow as of recording for a little while, and it's super fun. But I think when most people think of Pennsylvania, they think of Philadelphia, which of course was one of the first major cities. It was, for quite some time, the largest city in the colonies and ultimately in the early days of the United States. There's a reason that the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention and the Capitol were all in Philadelphia at one time. However, although Philadelphia was the largest city, large cities at this time were not awesome. And Philadelphia had all the sort of downsides of large cities. And it's not large by today's standards. I mean, you're talking, 15,000, 20,000 people, I think, at most in the 1700s. But it did have a lot of people in a concentrated area and was in a part of the country where during summertime it got really hot and miserable. It still does, from my understanding. I've actually never been to Philadelphia, but what I always hear is that summers in Philadelphia are brutal. And it was really smelly because they couldn't find a way to get rid of all the human waste and animal waste. There were butcheries all over the place. That was not something people were terribly adept at in the 18th century. And yellow fever was present there all the time in the summertime. And I think malaria as well. So a lot of disease, a lot of bad smells. And that is why, even in the colonial period, I think it's appropriate to say that Pennsylvania, with Philadelphia as far and away its most important locale, Pennsylvania's colonial motto is diseased and malodorous since 1700. I'm just kidding. Pennsylvania, you're awesome. And then New Jersey, still overshadowed by New York and Pennsylvania. It was back then. It kind of continues to be. Again, come on, New Jersey. I love you, but you know it's true. By the way, stepdad and stepdad's parents, Newark people. So, got some New Jersey ties in me as well. All right, I have talked enough, damn it. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I had a lot to go through this episode. And again, I am kind of trying new things, and I think this was fun. I want to try to do it a little bit more this way and work in some jokes and not just all of the serious stuff. I want to be informative, but I also want to try to make this fun and entertaining because I think there's no reason it can't be both. So, thank you for sticking with me. I appreciate it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you found it informative. If you would like to contact me, please reach out at howthehelldiddwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can text or call at 951-525-5536. Give me your thoughts. I'd love to hear them. Seriously, I'm sure it will be amusing whether they're good or bad. Thanks again. Take care. I will catch you guys next time around. All right?